Doing a report on Dwight D. Eisenhower, and a little bit on his family history was that Eisenhower actually means iron hewer in German, which is where his family is from. But they moved to Switzerland in the 17th century due to religious persecution. But they actually ended up moving to the United States a century later, and they settled in Newark, Pennsylvania. Uh, also, in the 1880s, they ended up moving again and settling in Kansas, which where their home had stayed. And Dwight was born October 14th, 1890. He was born in Denison, Texas. He was the third of seven boys, and he was nicknamed Ike. And actually, all the boys in that family were nicknamed Ike, like Big Ike or Little Ike. But with him, Ike was the only one that where the nickname actually stuck. Um, he was originally going to be named David Dwight Eisenhower, but there was already a David in the family, so they didn't want to confuse it. So he was named Dwight David Eisenhower instead. In 1892, they moved back to Abilene, Kansas, where he considered that to be his home. Growing up, he developed a keen and enduring sense of adventure and love for the outdoors, and he had often played cards with an illiterate person named Bob Davis who camped at Smoky Hill River, which was right around where they lived. Um, though his mother was very against work, seeing as she was a Jehovah's Witness, he still had read all her history books and grew to love war and military very early on. That sparked his interest in it and really just lasted through his life. Eisenhower, for his schooling, he attended Abilene High School and graduated in the class of 1909. As a freshman, he injured his knee, and it proved to be very, very life-threatening because he developed a leg infection, and the doctor said the only way he was going to live is if he amputated his leg, but miraculously he recovered and was able to play sports throughout high school and college. He and his brother Edgar both wanted to attend college, but they did not have the funds for it, so they settled on taking shifts, working. So Dwight would work 1 year, and then while Edgar went to school, and Dwight agreed to take a second shift for the following year, but during that time he met a friend named Swede Hazlitt who was applying for the Naval Academy and convinced Dwight to also do the same, and he actually ended up accepting entrance into West Point in 1911. A little bit about his personal life was that he met and fell in love with Mamie Geneva Dowd of Boone, Iowa, 6 years in his junior, and while he was stationed in Texas. He and her family were also immediately taken with one another, so it was very easy for them to get along and fall in love. He proposed to her romantically on Valentine's Day in 1916, where they were married the following year on July 1st. Eisenhower's had two sons, although his first son, Dwight Icky Eisenhower, he was born September 24th, 1917, and he had sadly died of scarlet fever in 1921 at the age of only 3 years old. Although their second son, John Sheldon Dowd Eisenhower, was born August 3rd, 1922, and while they were in Panama, and he had remained alive and was healthy, and it all seemed to work out for them. A little bit about his personal life was that Eisenhower was a very big golf enthusiast, and he later joined the Augusta National Golf Club in 1948, and he was also very into oil paintings. It was his second hobby, and in his retirement he had done over 240 oil paintings of landscapes of old presidents and his wife and grandchildren. And a bit about his early military career. After graduation in 1915, he became Lieutenant Eisenhower, put in for the assignment for the Philippines, but he was denied sadly, and he did most of his work at home in Texas and Georgia and just various camps and served with the infantry. He was immediately requested overseas because he wanted to be part of the action and fight on the war front, but he was denied, and he went back to Kansas at Fort Leavenworth to serve. Once again, his spirits were raised when his unit received orders to go overseas to France, but it was crushed when a week later, the armistice was signed, and right before they're about to leave. So he was sad and bitter about it, but he was still received a Distinguished Service Medal for his work at home because he was very hard working and diligent. After the war, he reverted to his regular rank of captain, and a few days later was promoted to major, which was a rank that he held for awesomely 16 years. After that, World War II had begun again, and after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he served until June 1942 with the responsibility of creating the major war plans for Japan and Germany, which was a very high honor and a lot of impressive work that he had to put in. And then President Roosevelt in 1943 decided to put Eisenhower, not his peer Marshall, who was also a very high-ranking military involvement, and he decided that he would be the supreme Allied commander in Europe, and not Marshall, which was just very impressive for Eisenhower. As well as the officers and troops under him, he had learned valuable lessons in their previous operations, and he had learned many skills, and he had put that to work as in the operation we know as D-Day, and thanks to him, it was a very costly yet successful mission, and it was just thanks to him that it was so successful. As the 1948 election approached, Eisenhower was repeatedly urged by everyone from any political party to run, and even President Truman had approached him and said that he would be his vice president if he had run. But he still decided he didn't want to do this, and he thought it was foregoing his only chance to be running for president. But after that, in 1948, he became president of Columbia University instead, and had worked on his memoir called Crusade in Europe, and critics had regarded this as a very fine memoir and one of the best out there, and it was just a financial success as well. But despite his distaste for the presidency originally, he ended up becoming president on November 4th, 1952, by winning by a landslide, and was elected the United States' 34th president. His domestic policy picked up where Roosevelt's New Deal and Fair Deal had left off, and his foreign policy he made reducing Cold War tensions through military negotiation and main focus of his administration. In 1953, he orchestrated the armistice and brought peace to South Korea, which was a very big deal at the time, and helped orchestrate a lot of peace. Also, he made the famous Atoms for Peace speech at the United Nations General Assembly. In 1955, he met with the Russian, British, and French leaders at Geneva and further quelled the threat of atomic war. He was re-elected in 1956, winning by an even larger margin than he had before, which was very impressive. Even though at this time he was suffering from health-related issues, including he had a heart attack at the time, he still was elected again. During his second term, he continued to promote his Atoms for Peace program. This promoted applying atomic energy to peaceful uses rather than weaponry and warfare, which would really help solve Cold War tensions and ease them up. In his second term, he also grappled the crisis in Lebanon and Suez accomplishments as well. During his administration, he created the United States Information Agency and established Hawaii and Alaska as states as well. Eisenhower also supported the creation of the interstate highway system during his time in office. His distinctions include signing the 1957 Civil Rights Act and setting up a permanent Civil Rights Commission. Eisenhower was additionally responsible for signing the bill to form NASA, which, as we know, is famous and very, very prominent and important. He poised to depart the office in January of 1961. He gave a televised farewell address, which he warned the nation against the dangers of Cold War military industrial complex. Later in life, he retired to a farmhouse in Gettysburg with his wife, Mamie. Although he resigned from commission, he was very active in political life, and he spoke at conventions, and he was just very active. He also kept office in Gettysburg College for the remainder of his life, where he held meetings and wrote his memoirs. He spoke at the 1964 Republican National Convention and appeared at the Barry Goldwater and Republican campaign commercial from Gettysburg, building on how I was saying that he had spoken a lot and been very active in political life after he retired. Unfortunately, though, he had to pass on March 28th, 1969, and he died in Washington, D.C. of a congestive heart failure at Walter Reed Army Hospital. The following day, his body was moved to Washington National Cathedral's Bethlehem Chapel, where he later reposed for 28 hours, and then he was later moved on April 2nd to where he had later rest officially at the Eisenhower Presidential Library, where he was buried alongside his 3-year-old son, who died in 1921, and later was buried next to his wife, who died in 1979. After he left office, his political legacy had declined greatly, and people regarded him as a very poor president, very inactive compared to his successor, who was President Kennedy, who was very popular. But although this had been the case, he is still regarded as one of the top 10 presidents of United States history, and is remembered as one of a very loved presidents. So that's my report, so thank you for listening.